Good evening, friends. Thank you for coming. It's really a joy to be here in Chennai and Tamil Nadu and to be able to speak about these great teachings that have not only been given to us, but have really formed the whole thrust of our life. As Nayaswami Dharmini was saying, we came to meet Swami Kriyananda more than 50 years ago. We were young then, our hair was longer and of a different color. And we've spent our entire life now, entire adult life, being formed by these great teachings of Kriya Yoga and the great masters that we have in our lineage. We're going to speak tonight on the subject of Kriya Yoga, the answer to life's problems. And so I want to talk a little bit first about the lineage of great masters and what Kriya Yoga is. It all starts really with Babaji. Yogananda said that Babaji is an incarnation of Lord Krishna. And he is a deathless master. He's well known here in Tamil Nadu, and so I don't need to dwell on it as much as I might in other places. But he's a deathless master who has been alive for many centuries now, and his job is to dispense the teachings and the proper spirituality. Many of the greatest masters have had contact with him and been commissioned to do their work by him. In our particular lineage, he drew one of our great masters, Lahiri Mahashaya, to him in the Himalayas in 1863, so almost 150 years ago now. And at that time, he released to the world the ancient teachings of Kriya Yoga. Kriya Yoga is a very ancient form of meditation, an ancient form of spirituality. In the autobiography of a yogi by Paramahansa Yoganandaji, he makes this statement, quoting his Sanskrit teacher. He said that Kriya Yoga is the most effective technique to attain self-realization by self-effort ever given to mankind. And I don't mean that only from our lineage. This is an ancient teaching, as I said. It has been given to great world leaders and great innovators from thousands of years ago. The reason that it is so powerful is that Kriya Yoga is a technique of meditation, but not just a technique of meditation that is somehow an outward technique. It works with the very central aspect of ourselves. Paramahansa Yogananda said that the true altar is not an altar like this, beautiful though it might be. The true altar that we worship at is the altar of our own central nervous system. It's our mind, it's our nervous system, and it's our astral body that actually is the area of consciousness that we are going to relate to the world, but ultimately going to relate to our own deeper self, our own higher self, that self that is united to God. So Kriya Yoga works directly on the energies of the central nervous system. It's a type of pranayama that is done in deep meditation and takes some training to be able to receive it. But now many hundreds of millions of people around the world are getting trained and practicing Kriya Yoga. But I'm not here to push any one technique. And I want also to say that if anything I say tonight somehow conflicts with your spiritual path, then disregard that which I've said, that part of it. Because we aren't here as Swami Kriyananda used often to say, I don't want to convert you to anything except to your own highest self. And so we will talk about Kriya Yoga tonight, and here in Chennai we offer many classes that lead up to initiation in Kriya Yoga. Just last night we held an initiation for many new members who were trained and have been working to receive this technique. It takes some months, about a year, to learn the preliminary techniques that lead up to it. But the technique of Kriya Yoga is different than some other aspects of spirituality. And I want to talk about that because from that time in 1863, Kriya Yoga was passed down from master until it came to Paramahansa Yogananda. And his commission from Babaji was to take these great teachings from India and come to America. And he did that in 1920. So in 2 years, we will have the 100th anniversary of him coming to America to bring these great teachings of India, and especially the path of Kriya Yoga, to America. But his coming to America created a spiritual revolution around the world, but most especially in America, and then spread to the West. And as Sri Kartikeyanji has mentioned, his autobiography is the best-selling spiritual autobiography of all times, because it is so powerful and has spread the energy of spirituality around the world. But in America, Paramahansa Yogananda began teaching in 1920, and he continued. He became the most popular lecturer in America at the time, in the 1920s and 1930s. Halls that were the largest in any given city, halls that held several thousand people, he would fill night after night after night for his classes and his lectures, because what he brought was not just a new way of worshiping God, it was a revolution. And one of the things that he did was to combine the East and the West, the best of the East and the best of the West, to bring that together. But one of the differences that he brought to America, and this was all done by the will of Babaji, one of the great differences is that he said, the time for knowing God has come. So there's a change of ages that brought these great masters to bring this teaching out at this time. But the big change that has happened is that for centuries, all over the world, here in India especially, but also in Western countries, God has been worshipped. God is a part of us. In fact, on the deeper level, God is us. We are simply an extension of God's consciousness. And so naturally, within us, within our soul, there is the impulse to worship God. But worshiping God is one thing, because worshiping God has God outside of ourself. He's on an altar, or he's in a murti, and we worship him. But the teachings of yoga are different in this way from merely worshiping God. We don't worship God, we try to realize God. That's the difference between yoga and more outward forms of spirituality. All forms of spirituality bring us toward God. But the teachings of yoga are meant to unite our consciousness with the consciousness of God. Yoga means union, and it means especially the union of our individual soul, our individual consciousness, with the vast consciousness of creation and of God's consciousness beyond creation. And so in the practice of yoga, and this is not only in our lineage, it's in all lineages that have great masters of yoga, the highest state is one of complete, as Yogananda called it, self-realization, where you realize yourself as being one with God. There's the ego, which is the separation, the individual, what we think of ourselves. If you were asked to introduce yourself to someone, if you were asked to describe yourself, you would probably begin with your name, perhaps your age, your occupation, where you were from. All of those things, if you think about it, if you think about the totality of consciousness, the ego, the description of the ego is how to limit you from that vast field of unity and differentiate you until finally your self-definition makes you a unique individual, different from all other individuals. And that is the essence of the ego. Yogananda described the ego as the soul which is united with God, the soul in a state of consciousness where it believes itself to be separate from God, separate from other people. And therefore, what yoga does, the whole purpose of yoga, as Swami Kriyananda said, the whole purpose of the spiritual path is to dissolve the ego, dissolve that sense of separation. And so if we're launched on the desire, the quest, Yoganandaji called it man's eternal quest, because the fact that we came from God, that God is our essence, propels us to go back to God, to do those practices that bring us back into union with God. And so those practices make up the practice of yoga, the attempt to find union with God and with all other people. And so the practice of yoga, and especially Kriya Yoga, the whole purpose of it is to expand our consciousness and to bring us into a state of unity with God and with God's creation. Until, as Yogananda said, I killed Yogananda long ago. No one dwells in this temple, meaning in this body, except God. Meaning that he didn't have that same sense of separation, that same sense. I loved Swami Kriyananda, our lifelong teacher, great master. He's called the ego a bundle of self-definitions. So all those self-definitions, that bundle of self-definitions that differentiate us, is what the ego is. Yogananda said he killed that bundle of self-definitions long ago. And when you stop the definitions that separate you, then your mind expands into all definitions, all beings, all things throughout the universe. And so the great masters, as I say, not only of our lineage, but the great yogic masters have always achieved that highest state, often called the state of samadhi, or the state of self-realization. So yoga is meant to bring us to that state. Now yoga has many different ways to practice it, because it is, Yoganandaji said something very interesting. He said that a true teaching, a true scripture, has to be true on all levels. It has to be true on a physical level. It has to be true on mental and emotional levels. And it has to be true on a spiritual level. And so the teachings of yoga have a physical component to it. In fact, in the West, yoga is kind of mistranslated. It's frankly, Westerners are very good at missing the point about deeper teachings. And so they take the great science of yoga and they take one tiny little aspect of it, which is the yoga postures or the asanas, and they call that yoga, which it is, of course, but they don't practice it as yoga by and large. They practice it as simply a physical aspect that's good for the body or slims the hips or makes one flexible, but they don't practice it in the depth that it was meant from the great teachings of India to give us, which is the movement of our consciousness to expand it and expand it. So the physical elements of yoga are absolutely valid, but they should be practiced in such a way that they help us not just have a healthy body, but they help us to have a healthy consciousness, an expansive consciousness. And so if yoga postures are practiced in that way, they can indeed help us to move toward that ultimate goal, which is union with God. And so that ultimate goal is what everyone is after. We had a very interesting encounter. We have a friend who was with Swami Kriyananda when Swami Kriyananda lived in India from 58 until 1962, and he began a great work here. And at that time, he had some associates, and so we have a friend who is still living from that time. And his mother hosted Swami Kriyananda in Delhi for several years. And she had many, many saints. If you have heard of a saint from northern India, that saint probably visited her home. Anandamoy Ma, Nimkrili Baba, Yogananda did not, but Sri Yukteswar did. Many saints came and passed through her home. She passed away some years ago, but her son is still in contact with her on a subtle level. He has dreams of her, occasionally visions. He hears her speaking to him on a very regular basis. He told us an amazing story. He said that his mother, Rani Ban, who has passed away, is often in contact with Babaji on the astral plane, on the subtle heavenly plane. And she said, on behalf, I think, of all of us, she asked Babaji, there is so much darkness in the world right now. Can't you do something to suppress this darkness? And he said to her, it is not my job to suppress the darkness. My job is to increase the light. And so taking that as his directive for all of us, our job as spiritual seekers is not necessarily even to try to suppress the darkness within our own selves. Master, we call Yoganandaji Master. Master said that the greatest sin is to think of yourself as a sinner. In other words, thinking of yourself, oh, I'm this terrible person, oh, I've done that, I shouldn't be this way. That doesn't help our consciousness. It helps our consciousness to not think of the faults that we have, but to think of the potential that we have, of the light. So increase the light. Yogananda used this illustration. He said that you can have a cave or a cavern that has been in darkness for 1,000,000 years. Think of your subconscious as that cavern. It can have contained darkness for a long, long time. But he said, if you bring a light into that cave where it's been dark for 1,000,000 years, instantly that darkness vanishes. So bring the light into our own consciousness, and instantly those things that we are trying to overcome or that we don't like in ourselves or that we are feel are displeasing, that cause us problems, because the topic tonight is Kriya Yoga, the answer to life's problems. So the problems that we have are caused by the fact that we haven't brought light yet into our lives. It's caused by darkness. It's caused by lower consciousness. And so what do I mean by lower consciousness? It means, lower consciousness means essentially the contraction of our self-definition more and more into the ego, into that sense of separation from others. And what's the result? As we emphasize our differences, as we emphasize our uniqueness from others, what is the result? The result is that we don't care what we do to other people. We can cheat at work. We can lie. We can steal. We can have violence. All of those things are the result of the shrinking of consciousness. The practice of Kriya Yoga, the practice of any spiritual techniques that uplifts the consciousness, expands the mind in such a way that we begin to feel our unity with other people. We experience this so often in the life of Swami Kriyananda. One time he came from Italy, where we also have a large Ananda center in Italy. He came from Italy to Delhi, or Gurgaon, where he had a little home there. And he was stiff. This was in his later years. He was stiff after the practice, after the long trip and the flight. So someone suggested, well, we can have a young man we know who gives very nice, gentle massages. He can come and work with you. And so he came, and Swami Kriyananda, all he had was the bed to lay on, and the young man was giving him a massage on the bed. Swami said to him, wouldn't it be better if you had a massage table? Then you wouldn't have to lean down so much. And the young man said, well, yes, that would be easier, but they're more expensive. They're quite expensive. This was the first time Swami had ever met this boy. And he said, well, I'll buy you a massage table, just like that, because he felt the expansion of his heart. And the young man said, oh, they're quite expensive. And Swami said, that's all right. Find out the price and I'll purchase it for you. And so he did that. And the next day the young man came back and said, oh, sir, they're much more expensive than I thought, so you don't need to do that. Swami said, no, I want to. So he bought this young man the massage table. But the important thing is not just that he did that. There was a beautiful ending to this story. This young man, as he was leaving, said that I grew up an orphan on the street. I never knew my parents. I just had to make my way as best I could. And he said that doing that, I have a family now. I have 2 children to support. I'm working 2 or 3 jobs, massage being one of them. He said, but living the way that I did, coming up the way that I did, the thing that I missed most was the love of a parents, especially the love of a father. And today I have found finally the love of a father for me, and it has filled that hole in my heart that is there. Now that's the result of the uplifted consciousness, is that we naturally feel love. We naturally feel compassion. We naturally follow all of the laws of Dharma, because in that uplifted consciousness, what we're really doing is we're uniting our consciousness with the consciousness of God, and God is pure love and pure joy. And so the practice of Kriya Yoga is meant to help us lift up our consciousness and to expand all of the qualities to uplift all of our qualities, and in that expanded consciousness is finally the permanent solution to the problems that plague us. And if everyone in the world could learn to be a Kriya Yogi, we would have no wars, we would have no poverty, it would cure all social ills. Now that's too much to ask, but nonetheless, where people are, they are like lights that light up the darkness around them. And so as you uplift your consciousness, you will experience this for yourself, and you will become a great light source for the others around you. Later, when we finish, we will see a movie that illustrates many of these principles, the answer and the search for God. It's the story of Swami Kriyananda, and it's, for me, the most beautiful depiction of the guru-disciple relationship that has ever been put on film. I do hope that you'll be able to stay and see that wonderful film. Thank you.